Use code SPIKEFEEDERS for 5% off at face-to-facegames.com. You can shop face-to-face games in US dollars, Canadian dollars, or even euros, and they'll ship just about everywhere. That's code SPIKEFEEDERS at checkout at face-to-facegames.com to help support the show.
We're back, MLC action, this is Game 6. In this one, Mord is going first and he's playing Mizzix. This is an Izzet Storm deck that relies on cost reduction, it runs the Firemind's Foresight combo, and it also has a ton of Breach stuff in it. Next up, our hero Jim is playing Breya Consult. Didn't go so well the last time he tried to Ad Nauseam, but this deck's got a lot of tricks up his sleeve and just might surprise you. It runs Breach, it runs Bomberman, and we'll see what happens today. Next up, Claire is playing Tymna Kamahl. This deck is quote-unquote win-conless. That's just a $10 way of saying it wins via combat damage. The idea is Claire wants to gum up the board with a ton of hate bears, then land Kamahl, giving them all +3/+3 in trample, and swinging in for game. Finally, Islane. Islane's playing Minsc, and if you watched the MLC draft, you'll know that Islane picked this one pick before I was going to in the first round. I love this deck, I've played it a couple times on the channel with a lot of success, but the idea is we're using Minsc as a sack outlet. This means you can use Pattern of Rebirth to get Protean Hulk, and from there you're off to the races. Let's get right into it. There's no pre-game effects, so Mord starts the game by drawing a card. He plays Seagate Reborn, taking 3 damage, going to 37. This comes into play untapped. He casts a Mana Crypt, then follows it up with a Jace Vryn's Prodigy. It resolves and Mord passes. Jim draws a card, plays a Plateau, and casts Esper Sentinel. He passes the turn. Claire draws, plays a Misty Rainforest, and cracks it, going to 39. She grabs a Bayou, and then uses it to cast Avacyn's Pilgrim. She passes the turn. Islane draws a card, plays a Mana Confluence, and taps it, taking 1 to cast Ragavan. He passes the turn. Mord starts off turn 2 by flipping for Mana Crypt, loses the flip, and takes damage. He draws a card, plays an island, and passes to Jim. Jim untaps, draws a card, and plays a Luxury Suite, then passes the turn. Claire untaps and draws a card. She plays a Windswept Heath, immediately cracking it, going to 38, and grabs a Savannah. She casts Deafening Silence. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Claire doesn't pay, so Jim draws 1 card. Claire casts Hushbringer, and it resolves. With nothing else to do, she passes the turn. Islane untaps, draws a card, and plays Boseiju as his land for turn. He casts a Fyndhorn Elves. In his end step, Mord activates Jace to draw a card and discards Brain Freeze. Then Islane finishes his turn. Mord starts out turn 3 by untapping and flipping for Mana Crypt in his upkeep. He takes no damage. He draws a card, then activates Jace, drawing a card and discarding Jeska's Will. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide, giving him just enough mana to cast Mizzix. It resolves, and in Mord's end step, Jim casts Enlightened Tutor. He grabs Arcane Signet, puts it on top of his library, and Mord finishes passing the turn. Jim untaps, draws the Arcane Signet, plays a Marshflats, and cracks it, going to 39, grabbing Underground Sea. He casts Dothy Voidwalker. It resolves, and he passes the turn. Claire untaps, draws a card, and casts Tymna. She moves to combat, attacking Jim with Hushbringer. She gains a life off of Lifelink, then in the post-combat main, she'll lose 1 and draw a card. She plays a Marshflats as a land for turn, and cracks it, getting a Scrubland. With nothing else going on, she passes to Islane. Islane untaps, draws a card, and plays a Cavern of Souls, naming Human. He moves to combat, attacking Claire with Ragavan. There's no blocks, so Islane creates a treasure. Claire's top card is Bloodstained Mire, so no help there. Islane casts Minsc. Hushbringer prevents the ETB trigger, so there's no boo here, and Islane passes the turn. Mord kicks off turn 4 by untapping and flipping for Mana Crypt, taking damage. He casts Izzet Signet, which triggers Esper Sentinel. He pays for it. With that, he passes to Jim. Jim untaps, draws a card, and plays a Steam Vents untapped, taking 2. He casts Arcane Signet. In his end step, Claire casts Enlightened Tutor and grabs Survival of the Fittest. Jim passes the turn. Claire untaps, drawing Survival of the Fittest. She casts Archon of Emeria, then moves to combat. She swings Tymna at Jim and Hushbringer at Islane. There's no blocks. Claire gains 3 from the lifelink, then moves to post-combat main and loses 2 and draws 2 off of Tymna. She plays Overgrown Tomb untapped, taking 2, then passes to Islane. Islane untaps, draws, and plays Gemstone Caverns. This enters tapped due to the Archon. He moves to combat, attacking Jim with Ragavan, and Minsc at Mord. There's no blocks, and when Ragavan connects, it makes a treasure. Jim exiles Diabolic Intent off the top. In his post-combat main, Islane casts the Diabolic Intent, sacrificing Ragavan. Islane tutors up a card, but we don't know what he got. In his end step, Mord activates Jace, drawing a card, then discarding Soul Ring. Still in the end step, Mord casts Stern Dismissal, targeting Archon of Emeria to return it to Claire's hand. Esper Sentinel triggers, and Mord pays. This also triggers Mizzix, and Mord gets an experience counter. Then Islane finishes up his turn. On turn 5, Mord untaps and rolls for Mana Crypt, taking damage. He plays an Arid Mesa, then casts Dockside Extortionist. Dockside does not trigger due to Hushbringer. He follows it up with a Windfall, whose casting cost is reduced by 1 due to Mizzix. Mord forgets his Mizzix trigger here, and nobody notices. Windfall triggers Esper Sentinel, and Mord doesn't pay, so Jim draws a card. The Windfall count is currently at 6, but Jim doesn't want it to happen, so he casts a Red Elemental Blast to counter the Windfall. With nothing else going on, Mord passes the turn. Jim untaps, draws a card, and plays a Misty Rainforest. He immediately cracks the Misty Rainforest, going to 30, grabbing a Tundra, then passes. Claire untaps, draws a card, and casts a Sanctum Prelate. This resolves, and Claire chooses 2. She casts a Null Rod, triggering Esper Sentinel. Claire doesn't pay, and Jim draws. Islane responds to Null Rod by sacrificing a treasure to cast Swords to Plowshares, targeting Hushbringer. Claire moves to combat, swings Tymna at Islane, and there's no blocks here. Claire gains 2 off of the lifelink, and in her post-combat main, she loses 1, draws a card, then plays a forest, and passes. Islane untaps and draws. And we have a Judge Call. Claire casts Null Rod despite there being a Sanctum Prelate in play on 2, preventing it. We explain the situation to the judge, and because not much has happened, we back up, and Null Rod is returned to Claire's hand. Unfortunately, while I was editing this game, it occurred to me that I drew a card off of Claire casting the Null Rod, and we probably shouldn't have backed this up. Islane still decides to Swords the Hushbringer on Claire's end step. Islane untaps and draws a card. He takes 1 off of the Mana Confluence to cast Natural Order, sacrificing Fyndhorn Elves. This triggers Esper Sentinel, and Islane pays for it. Mord casts Flusterstorm, targeting the Natural Order, successfully countering it. This triggers the Esper Sentinel again, and Mord responds by cracking his Arid Mesa to find a land, which allows him to pay for the Esper Sentinel. This does it for Islane's turn, and he passes to Mord. Mord untaps and rolls for Mana Crypt, taking damage, going to 25. He activates Jace to draw a card, and discards Force of Negation. He moves to combat, swinging Mizzix at Jim for 2. Jim doesn't block, and goes to 28 with 2 commander damage marked. Mord passes the turn. Jim untaps, draws a card, and casts Gamble. Claire responds by flashing in Aven Mindsensor. Jim searches the top 4, grabs 1 card, and discards Lion's Eye Diamond. He plays a Spire of Industry as his land for turn, then passes to Claire. Claire untaps, draws a card, and slams Serra Ascendant. She casts an Elvish Mystic, and follows it up with an Archon of Emeria, then moves to combat. The Sanctum Prelate is coming at Jim, Tymna's going towards Mord, and Aven Mindsensor is coming in for 2 in the air at Islane. Then in post-combat main, loses 3 and draws 3 cards. She passes to Islane. Islane untaps, draws a card, plays a Bountiful Promenade, and passes. Mord untaps, rolls for Crypt, and takes no damage, but has nothing to do on his turn, so he just passes. Jim untaps, draws a card, and casts Breya. With the Hushbringer gone, it'll enter the battlefield and make 2 Thopters. Then Jim passes. Claire untaps, draws a card, and plays an Ancient Tomb as land for turn. She casts Kamahl, then moves to combat, triggering Kamahl. The Serra Ascendant's coming at Jim, Tymna and Sanctum Prelate at Islane, and the Archon and Aven Mindsensor at Mord. No blocks all around, and Claire gains 15 life off of lifelink. In her post-combat main, she loses 3 life and draws 3 cards. She moves to her end step, discarding to hand size. Survival of the Fittest, Null Rod, and Stony Silence all end up under the Dothy Voidwalker. Then she passes the turn. Islane untaps, draws a card, and plays Dryad Arbor as his land for turn. This enters the battlefield tapped due to Archon of Emeria. In Islane's end step, Mord activates Jace to draw a card and discard Snapback. Then Islane passes to Mord. Mord starts off turn 8 by untapping, rolling for Crypt, and taking no damage. He draws a card. He moves to pass the turn, but in his end step, Jim activates Breya, sacrificing 2 Thopters, targeting Sanctum Prelate. This kills the Prelate, and Mord continues passing. Jim untaps, draws a card, and passes. Claire untaps, draws a card, and plays City of Brass as land for turn. She casts Green Sun Zenith X = 5. Jim responds by overloading Cyclonic Rift. Mord responds to the Cyclonic Rift by activating Jace, drawing a card and discarding Lotus Petal, then taps his rocks for mana. Green Sun Zenith resolves and Claire gets a Shaya. Claire casts Deafening Silence. Mord responds by casting Fierce Guardianship. Then Claire passes and discards Esper Sentinel, Avacyn's Pilgrim, Aven Mindcensor, Elvish Mystic, and Eladamri's Call to hand size. Islaine untaps, draws a card for turn, and casts Destiny Spinner. He recasts Minsc, and this time when it enters, it makes a Boo. Boo's got haste, so Islaine moves to combat and attacks Mord with Boo for 1. With nothing else doing, Islaine passes to Mord, and Mord kicks off turn 9 by untapping, drawing a card, and recasting his Mana Crypt. Jim misses the Esper Sentinel trigger here, but nobody noticed. Mord recasts Izzet Signet, then casts Dockside Extortionist. The Dockside count is at 4, so when it enters, Mord makes 4 treasures. He casts Rhystic Study and passes the turn. Jim untaps, draws a card, and casts Wishclaw Talisman, not paying for Rhystic Study. Mord draws. Wishclaw Talisman resolves and enters with 3 counters on it. Jim activates Wishclaw Talisman, removing a counter and giving it to Claire. Jim casts Underworld Breach, again not paying for Rhystic Study. Mord draws. Mord responds by exiling Jace to cast Force of Will. Jim responds by casting Miscast, targeting Force of Will, not paying for Rhystic Study. Mord draws again. Mord cracks a treasure and pays the 3 for Miscast. With Force of Will still on the stack, Jim cracks Dothy Voidwalker to cast Fierce Guardianship, countering the Force of Will. Again not paying for Rhystic Study, so Mord draws. Underworld Breach resolves, then Jim casts Lion's Eye Diamond from his graveyard, exiling Marshflats, Misty Rainforest, and Dothy Voidwalker. From here on out, Jim doesn't pay for the Rhystic Study for anything he does, and Mord draws off of each spell. Jim casts Rite of Flame. He then cracks LED, discarding Ragavan and Mox Diamond, floating 3 blue. He casts Gamble from his graveyard, exiling Mox Diamond, Ragavan, and Miscast. Gamble resolves, and Jim searches up Brain Freeze and discards it because it's the only card in his hand. Storm count's currently at 8, so Jim casts Brain Freeze. Storm triggers and all 9 copies are pointed at himself. Jim mills 27 cards, and this is what he mills. At this point, Mord, Claire, and Islaine are satisfied, they concede, and the game is over. What a game this was. All 4 of us thought that Claire was going to run away with that one, but a couple well-placed removal spells allowed me to break the locks and get out ahead. This brings my overall record to a very respectable 2-4-0. And I'm not going to lie to you, this is a big relief. At this point I'm thinking, even if I lose out, I've still got a pretty good record. And if I win 1 more out of my remaining 4 games, it's actually going to be a really good record. That's it for this week. If you want to see more Minsc gameplay, make sure to check out these 2 games. I'll put the links in the description, and we'll catch you next time. Huge thanks to all of our patrons. We love trying new things like this, and your support really makes it possible. Hey, thank you for checking out the Spike Feeders on YouTube. If you're not subscribed yet, make sure you hit that subscribe button before you close the window. You can click on this link to check out our other great videos.